Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Andrew VanSingel. Thank you for joining us here today. Today being September 30th, the last day of Disaster Preparedness Month. And today we have a program called Disaster Relief and Compliance, Avoiding the Disaster Following the Disaster. This program has been being put on in partnership with the ABA Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness, the ABA Young Lawyers Division, Disaster Legal Services Program, and the ABA section of state and local government. The format today, going to be somewhat conversational. I'll be moderating this panel today. And if you have questions, be sure to utilize the chat feature. We'll try to address questions if they're relevant to the current speaking points, or there'll be a little bit of time afterwards to go through the questions here. So without further ado, I just wanted to briefly introduce our panel. We have Tom Barnard, and Tom is a former Assistant U.S. State's Attorney, military prosecutor, and military defense counsel with more than 20 years of government experience. He currently is at Baker Donelson. And we also have Erin Greten. Erin has 2 decades of experience working for FEMA and in other preparedness, response, and recovery related roles with the federal government. Erin is uniquely qualified to advise clients on their disaster preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. We're also joined with Michelle Munn, and she is a current senior advisor for GAO. So bear with me 1 minute here while I share my screen and we get the slides up and running. And we will go ahead and get started. All right, Tom, I'm going to do that multiple times here today. Tom, give us an overview. What can we expect to learn here today?
Thanks, and good afternoon. What we're going to talk about is just kind of some basics about audits and the audit process, who does the audits, what to expect in the context of these disaster relief situations. Obviously, there's a lot of money changing hands, and so there's a lot of opportunities for audits. We'll talk about the ways they end, possible outcomes, give you just a few common categories of things that may go wrong, put you some current examples in the news, and then give some advice on how to be prepared. So with that, I'm gonna hand over to Erin. The next slide.
Sure. So we're going to start off with what gets audited. The first thing you just need to know is the moment you touch a federal dollar, you can get audited. Every single federal program, grant, and loan is subject to audit. Specifically with respect to FEMA and most federal agencies, they use the Uniform Grant Administrative Requirements in 2 CFR Part 200, but not all agencies only follow the Part 2 CFR requirements. For example, HHS for PERF uses 45 CFR Part 75 Subpart F. But whether or not they have their own side regulations or just follow 2 CFR, the requirements are generally the same. So that's where you're going to find the requirement for costs to be reasonable and allocable, the requirement for procurements using federal funds, and the audit requirements for recipients and subrecipients. So the audit is intended to review how you manage the grant and ensures you follow the program's rules. So if you look at, 2 CFR 200.501A, that contains the requirement that a non-federal entity that expends $750,000 or more in federal awards during that entity's fiscal year must have an independent single audit for entities that only accept grants from one program or a program-specific audit conducted for that year. That is in addition to any audit that may be done by other auditors, which we'll get into shortly. There can be audits of an entire program such as the DHS IG's recent report on lessons learned from FEMA's initial response to COVID-19, an audit of a particular recipient. An example of that is a March 2021 report on FEMA's need to reduce a $579 million backlog of projects in its New York Public Assistance Grant Program, or down to a specific subrecipient, such as the DHS IG's September 2020 report recommended that FEMA recover $216.2 million awarded to the Recovery School District in Louisiana for Hurricane Katrina. So the audit rules and processes for grants are different than the rules for federal contractors. So I just wanted to flag that. So when we're talking about the processes and procedures today, we're not talking about the FAR requirements to most extent, although Tom might talk to some of that as he's going through his. So just remember that there are two different audit requirements depending on which seat you're sitting in, whether you're talking about grants or contracts. So next slide.
And just kind of underscore what Erin was saying, there are many different kinds of audits out there. Some are at kind of a more macro multi-agency level. That's what kind of GAO specializes in, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Some are regarding single programs, single spending efforts. But in general, there's various criteria that we kind of look at to help prioritize what will get audited. The first thing, obviously, if there's a statutory or regulatory requirement out there, if there's a mandate for an entity to go in and audit a program or a set of activities that must be answered. So that is the trigger for a number of audits. There's also kind of the effort to make sure that we're across the board targeting key resources and making sure that we're trying to chase the biggest bucket of federal spending dollars that are out there. So the larger programs do tend to get audited more. Nonetheless, smaller programs have their own kind of criteria for kind of lower level or more targeted efforts for auditing. We also have, there are various vehicles for congressional or federal agency or sometimes state officials to request audits. Again, at the federal level, this is mainly going to be a federal thing, but the responsive committees for the various policies will have their own targeted staff who will request audits of certain programs or federal activities. The agencies have their own IGs, they kind of, inspector generals, they prioritize which programs they think are either spending lots of money and worthy of oversight, or any kind of activity regarding improprietary or mishandling of funds or activities. That also tends to kind of raise eyebrows and trigger additional requests from Congress or agency efforts to go in and look at and kind of review the programs that are involved. So, and that kind of, all those kind of come on top of any regularly scheduled or periodic audits that an agency or a federal entity might have kind of in line with its own spending allocations and activities. So go ahead, back to Erin.
So so who are you going to be dealing with? One of the main points that we want to, one of the main reasons why we're doing this presentation is to help demystify the audit process. We don't want everybody to be thinking of auditors as these big, bad, scary things. You could be audited by any number of entities. So first are the private auditors, or those independent auditors. This is the type of audit that entities are probably most comfortable with. So this might be your single audit. This is the review of your financial documents, looking at the income, expenses, liabilities, internal controls of the entity. And as I mentioned before, so those who expend federal funds that are required to provide those who expend federal funds of over $750,000 a year are required to provide their own auditor for singular program audits. So if you've never done that before, there are rules for that in 2 CFR 200.509 explaining how to select an auditor. Another potential source of audit activity could be from the awarding agency, either the grantor, the federal agency, or the recipient. So the awarding agency always remains responsible for complying with the legal authorities and has the responsibility for managing the federal funds. So accordingly, those agencies will review the documentation supporting program eligibility throughout the life of the grant, in addition to a closeout review. And also the recipients that get the funds from the awarding agency and could be a pass-through entity out to subrecipients, they also have a continuing obligation to comply with the legal authority of the grant and managing their subgrants. So the state, tribe, territory may also review documentation supporting program eligibility, including financial documentation, to ensure that the costs were reasonable and eligible. Next slide.
Okay. And getting back to kind of who are the auditors, and there's these various layers of potential audit sources and activity. A lot of the federal audits are done by what's known as the Office of Inspector General, or you'll hear them as the IG within each agency. There's an independent entity that's responsible for going through and kind of making sure that the federal programs are running as Congress expects and as the laws are written. They're also charged, the inspectors general are also charged with trying to find fraud, waste, and abuse in program activities and spending. And they kind of, it goes a little bit beyond, so there's the aspect of what are the agencies supposed to be doing and what do they actually do? And typically the IGs, and as we'll get into a GAO, we also kind of try to make recommendations looking at how the agency activities or spending could be improved in terms of, are there areas that are problematic and that could be bolstered or improved by sometimes tweaking the law or the regulatory process. The IG does have a criminal law enforcement authority, and again, everything is, they are independent from the other agency program activities, so they're kind of perceived as kind of coming in to review what is going on and what is happening. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, that's where I've been for 18 years now. We are kind of independent, nonpartisan. Our head is sits for 15 years to kind of avoid the changing administration. A lot of the agencies, the administration or the senior leaders will change with the administration, but GAO, the leader stays on to kind of as a buffer against political interest and activities. We can audit any project. Again, we kind of are prioritizing the big dollars and the big spending programs that are out there. Typical thing that happens will be Congress will pass a law 4 or 5 years, and then it'll be in place for 4 or 5 years for a new program, and then we will go in place and kind of interview the agencies and request the data and kind of look at how the program is performing. We also get a lot of requests for program reviews if there's some kind of allegation of fraud that winds up in the news. So if there's, a teacher's retirement program where the teacher, it's a retirement program for teachers, and it comes to pass that the person who sold the portfolio of retirement assets is also wearing the hat of a teacher advocacy organization, then we will be asked to do a review of those kinds of programs at a higher level to see what kinds of conflict of interest and other sorts of activities are happening. So most of our requests are by congressional committees will request that we go in. Sometimes we get mandates. Sometimes the mandates are seem to be in unrelated bills, such as the Defense Authorization Act is the source of a lot of other kinds of non-defense audits for GAO. So they found a vehicle that way. And by contrast, the Inspector General, it's generally more of an in-house kind of targeted within the agency. What do they kind of see as being the high risk activities that they want to follow up on? So next slide, please. When we go in and kind of following on with the audit process, the typical audit process, both GAO and the IGs will follow the same kind of thing. We will decide what the topic is. Sometimes it's the request of Congress, sometimes it's in-house generated. We will send the agency a notification letter or engagement letter, basically notifying what the key questions that we're looking into, looking at the key activities, program activities that we're looking into, and kind of outline who the request is, who's asking for the request. We'll kind of outline some expected timeframes for when we might be doing the audit work and trying to develop a product. We'll meet with the various agency officials, and sometimes the subcontractors will sit in on some of these things too, to explain the nature of our work. Then the next multi-month effort is basically doing the audit work. Tends to be a lot of document requests and interviews that go along with that. A lot of the interviews kind of are just to get a lay of the land. We certainly kind of do the legal research to see what the program requirements are. But at the end of the day, we love data. We love documentation of activities, of decisions that were made. We do tend to, we like to take the original data regarding the agency's, not just spending, but benchmarks and things too, and rerun it ourselves to kind of see how things are going and identify any areas of questionable or inefficient activity. So at the end of that, and as kind of as subcontractors, or the contracting officials and the subcontracting officials will periodically tend to be drawn in by the agency officials that they're working with on the agency may or may not have a solid handle of kind of what's happening at the very local level for their contractors and their subcontractors. So you may get a lot of requests at the last minute for, hey, do we have this documentation? Hey, do we have this information? GAO is asking for it. That's kind of part and parcel, but we do try to make our requests weeks in advance. And by the time it filters down, there often has been some time that has passed. So as we do the field work, we come up with our message, we draft a report, we send it to the agency for review first for both technical comments and higher level comments as well. Again, you may be drawn in at this level, or subcontractors may be drawn in at this level to kind of provide technical comments and clarifications in that respect. Then we get ready to publish the report. We will send it to both the agency, again, for their formal technical edits and comments, and a draft report that goes to the Hill so they can kind of see what the current lay of the land is. The final report will get issued. If it's classified or deals with proprietary information, we will redact as necessary to kind of maintain any proprietary information that was provided in there. And then we issue the report with the agency's comments attached. So in some cases, there are specific kind of audits where you will identify necessary corrective actions. And so that is a different kind of process, but there's a whole follow-on process for that where the corrective action, the areas for corrective action are identified, and then it's up to the agency to figure out how to kind of solidify its internal controls or improve its internal controls to identify any of these identified deficiencies. In other cases, we have recommendations, as I mentioned, to the IG will do the same thing, kind of recommend that the agency shift in such a way that to kind of improve the process and ensure that that the program runs more efficiently. And so then we follow up with those recommendations as well. So we brief the Hill on both the classified and unclassified, or any information that's been redacted. We still tend to brief them and follow the recommendations to see how things go in the future. So what should I do if I'm so happily selected to be audited? If you are working with an agency official and or you're an agency, it's basically, we come to you and we do try to work with the agency officials. We understand that not everyone knows everything, but we do try to make our requests and request specific information, but we try to develop kind of a conversation with the impacted or the audited agency to kind of understand what their processes are. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we do look for data, we look for documentation. We like to have the conversations and obtain testimonial evidence on how things are going. But at the end of the day, we love hard paper, hard copy information, because it does kind of show what was happened and what was approved at that time.
Michelle, just a quick pop in here. So when it says the deadlines, what typically are the deadlines for these types of cases? Is it something that's there's guidelines, or does it depend on what's being audited? And are there extensions on those?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the specific audit and whether it's kind of a single program that's being conducted within the agency. They'll have their own guidelines. We typically make requests for information within a 30-day period, and we'll ask for cooperation or a response within 30 days. And if data is difficult to dredge up, then definitely talk to whoever is asking you for the information, because we are typically looking to kind of make sure that we get full information. And if that means an extension, that's not a bad thing necessarily. But our deadlines are typically also driven by when the Hill or in the OIG's case, kind of when their internal deadline cycle is as well. So there's kind of other reporting deadlines that kind of feed into the deadline that's given for a request for information.
And what I've experienced is auditors are typically willing to give extensions if you explain why you need it. And they're more likely to give you an extension if that's requested before the deadline expires. So to show that you're being proactive and that you really are trying and not just dragging out a delay.
And Michelle, I was going to comment your comment about that conversation being very important. I typically do have a lot of clients who say, oh, that seems like it's really broad. It's really outside what they should be looking at. It's really, they're being too invasive. They're actually disrupting our operations. So sometimes it's just another conversation, right? They just need to have and say, look, can we work through this? Can we, if it's impacting stuff, can we stagger it? A lot of times if you ask, and I've talked to them, you can figure out why it's within the scope, and it just doesn't appear like it. Obviously, they may be looking at interesting things, but maybe we could talk about that. That there's sometimes some points of contention, and you have to navigate through those. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. A lot of times the questions that we put down in our notification letter, which is kind of the first take that the agency sees regarding what are the key objectives and what are the key aspects that we're going to quote unquote audit, that will change from the initial, the lettering of those and the exact wording will change from the initial request till the end game based on kind of what we're finding and what we think is useful and helpful for the federal government to kind of look into. So just like we're having a conversation with the agency officials, we're also having conversations with congressional clients and others to kind of inform them like, hey, we started out on this road and yes, we're still looking into this, but there are other aspects that look like they are worth attention as well. And that is considered to be fair game for us. And we do have that authority, and we do have that authority to basically kind of self-direct to a certain extent. So the conversation may change a little bit and topics may migrate, but it is based on what our independent assessment is regarding the key issues and where we can help make sure that federal dollars are being spent wisely and that the federal programs are running efficiently.
And on that note, in past experience, I found that auditors don't particularly take kindly when you inform them that perhaps what they are requesting is not necessary. A lot of times they're asking for it because they want to find out whether it is necessary or not. So it is typically better to share rather than try to withhold. And if the auditors really are going down what you think is a wrong track or off base, you can always try and train them, share more information, explain to them what you're thinking about. But again, if it's coming with the intent of not sharing or withholding any information or being disruptive or dismissive, that's typically not well received.
Yeah. Fair enough. I mean, yeah, typically we'll start out kind of reading what we can to know what the regulatory environment or the laws surrounding what the program should be doing are out there. We'll go in, we'll have that basic understanding. We'll also work to understand what data systems are held within the agency or the contractors to kind of provide the information to help us understand what has happened. But yes, we do start kind of in the dark comparatively because we are coming in from a very different perspective, and we will work with the agency officials and their clients as well to understand what the lay of the land and the landscape is, and not try and waste your time with unnecessary requests by any means. But sometimes we are asking more open-ended questions to try to make sure we're not missing anything that could be key.
Yeah, and another thing that Michelle noted earlier is that they like documentation. So typically, folks may be inclined to explain how they did something, or to say, for example, oh, we developed a new policy. Instead of saying you developed a new policy, provide a copy of the new policy. Show that you actually have done the thing that you're talking about. And when you're going through your processes, document what your thoughts are, so you can provide them. Here's the present sense impression that I had as I reviewed something. That tends to reduce the likelihood that you'll receive the same questions over and over again from the auditor who's trying to get to that grain, to get to that documentary evidence. And you keep giving them the same thing over and over again, which is not what they're asking for, which is frustrating to both you and the auditor. Next slide. All right, so once you have, actually, these are just once you've gotten through the field work, you could end up having your results from the auditor. And we've got here a few slides that address different common areas that you should be aware of to try and avoid. So in March 2021, the DHSIG issued a report analyzing all of its recommendations involving FEMA public assistance grants issued from 2012 to 2018. Of the 964 recommendations, the vast majority involved contracting issues. So what we have here on this slide are some of the top, most frequently experienced contracting problems. And FEMA, seeing that this was a problem a few years ago, created something called the Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, or PDAT, specifically created to help train recipients and subrecipients on the procurement under grants rules. So they have a great website that contains guidance and training and templates that address all of the issues that are on this slide. So if you are looking for in-depth information on all those, feel free to go check out FEMA's website for the PDAT team. The most common issues I've seen occur actually occur at the very beginning of the procurement process and are the hardest to overcome because one can't turn back time and perform an independent cost estimate before soliciting bids or proposal, or can't target women and minority businesses after an award has been made, or even go back and compete a sole source award. So what can happen though, so for some of these things, you can amend a contract to add the federal terms, or put a ceiling on a time and materials contract, or you can actually terminate a contract after initiating a new procurement. So that could happen frequently in emergency work. So for example, with debris, an entity may need to immediately clear debris from the interstate or around a hospital, but more extensive debris removal may be done later after a proper competitive procurement. So just try to research the procurement requirements pre-disaster so that you are smart up on all the requirements so that you can follow them after disaster. Next slide.
Erin, I just want to chime in on one thing that's this maintaining records. I mean, this to me, in almost every case, that's a common problem in the sense that it's both important to the auditors and important to people like you and me, Erin, who are what I consider the cleanup crew for the cleanup crew, right? These problems usually arise years after the fact, and you're reconstructing history as to what happened. Employees have left, managers have moved on. You're trying to say, how did we do what? And it's this record keeping can make or break a response to an investigation, because a lot of times people do the right thing, they just don't have the evidence to show they did the right thing, and that's the real hard. That can be the hardest point.
Yeah, that ties right here into this next slide on the unsupported costs. So the auditors are going to be looking to see that all the costs are documented. So take it from receipt down all the way to expenditure. Follow that dollar. How was it used? Make sure that you have proper record keeping. So in times of disaster, entities tend to be focused on saving lives rather than keeping good records and following their procedures. So try to resist that and keep your records, put them in a easily accessible repository. Try to ensure a person or two is assigned to maintain those records is a really good start to that.
So Erin, quick question. As an attorney, in private practice, and Tom, you can chime in on this too, at what point are your clients engaging you? Is it after they've gotten a letter and they said, oh no, I got this audit? Or are you in the business of trying to help them when they're on the starting spot of trying to procure those contracts to help them avoid, getting into these pitfalls? Or is it, I would assume it's a little of both, but I mean, as a firm, I think it's ideal to be on the planning side of this as opposed to the reconstruction side of it.
Yeah, we're involved in a little column A, a little column B, and a little column C. So some of our clients bring us in early on to create a procurement manual, for example, so that they can have a federally compliant manual before an event happens, or to help them think through what are some of the things that we need to do now to be prepared for a disaster in the future. Others will bring us in after a disaster happens and help them to make sure that the contracts that they're issuing are federally compliant, that they're properly documenting costs, that they're thinking through all of the different eligible costs that they have. And then others bring us in after they're in trouble. So they've got for example, from FEMA, a negative determination memo, and they have found that they've been denied millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars or more. And they come to us looking for help to appeal that decision or arbitrate it. So it can be in any phase.
But I think to your point, Andrew, yeah, when we get a chance, if we have a client who's engaged, they often have an expert in their accounting department that knows how to allocate costs, but oftentimes they'll have a legal question. It's always better to do it ahead of time. We can often, if there's in doubt, run to the government, the point of contact at the government, the contracting technical representative or something to run that by, we advise. But in the response, we do more often than not, it's in something after the fact.
Very good.
All right, so the next common problem areas are on poor project accounting. Some entities may have many different buildings or activities going on simultaneously, and it's okay to combine purchasing efforts to maximize efficiency of scale, but try to track costs by project or by facility, and show how those costs were actually incurred. Only submit requests. Oh wait, we got ahead of ourselves a little bit. Can we step back one slide? Yeah, so on project accounting. So you want to track every dollar of federal funds from receipt to expense. You want to be able to show how those dollars, each dollar was spent, and that it was spent for an eligible purpose, with a proper procurement, or for an otherwise eligible costs. And it's not intermixed or potentially has been spent for something that was not eligible or was unreasonable. So I'm going to pause here if Tom or Michelle have anything that they want to add on accounting before moving on.
Well, I would just say common fraud I have seen is where a company may have a mix of federally funded projects and privately funded projects. And a common area that the government will look for is, are they shifting some of these overhead or general costs that they're for their commercial projects into the government pool to help their bottom line? And that's something that I think is always a warning area.
Yep. All right, next slide. So duplication of benefits. So I've put here the language from Section 312 of the Stafford Act, which does not just apply to FEMA. This applies to any federal agency administering any program providing financial assistance as a result of a major disaster or emergency. So this is something that comes into play occasionally, but definitely right now with COVID-19, where there are multiple different federal agencies that can potentially provide assistance. So agencies cannot duplicate benefits from any other source. So that includes other federal agencies, insurance, any other state program, any donations, or anything. So if you have a cost that is eligible from one federal agency, for example, and you go out and apply to another federal agency for assistance for that same cost because it is eligible under both programs, you cannot keep that assistance from both agencies. Right now, you can apply to multiple agencies. You need to let the other agencies know, if it's under COVID-19, let the other agencies know that you're going to be applying and seeking assistance, but you cannot keep a dollar that would duplicate assistance from another agency. Any points on that to add before we slide to the next slide?
I just think, this is many of the investigations I'm currently seeing are in this duplication of benefits, especially when you have the standard disaster relief, but also a lot of the CARES Act funding, PPP loans and other things. This is a big area of focus, I think.
Yeah, and GAO actually has a whole body of work now looking at kind of duplication and overlap for even at the program level for things that are just outright double dipping or duplication of effort among agencies.
So duplication's probably been around, since the inception of these grant funds, but just, in the last couple of years, or just actually in response to COVID with the PPP, how has this work really evolved? Is it much more complicated now, or is it like everything else that's tied to federal legislation, is that every day it gets more complicated because they add on more regulations and don't take any of them off?
My take is it's just a little slower on the discovery because it's coming from multiple agencies and multiple programs. And a lot of the prevention of duplication is simply in the attestations for receipt of the funds, as opposed to some kind of actual stop. When you accept the provider relief funds, if you've also received discovery, you're just attesting that it might not be discovered until much later when you do the filing. The filing dates for the PRF funds haven't even totally began. So I think what it is when you start doing it in multiple agencies, maybe funds not administered by, say, the same agency like FEMA, or it depends on, these kind of general audits or these things. So it's just a little slower on the detection, but I just think it's going to be more common because people have seen the opportunity. And I also think there's a greater chance for a mistake. I mean, the bottom line is businesses are applying out of necessity for all kinds of benefits, not knowing what they'll get at the end of the day. And they might not always track the fact that they've received for the same justification from multiple places because they applied for multiple places. So it's a lot of discipline on their part through no intentional misconduct, just to make sure they return money if it's already been awarded from somewhere else, or withdraw those applications if it's awarded from somewhere else. So it's a lot of times I think this double thing is not going to be a matter of intentional. I think it will just be because there's some overlap, multiple applications resulting in double award.
Yeah, that comes back to that good accounting and tracking those dollars from input to expenditure. And then outside of COVID-19, though, with respect to FEMA, typically FEMA won't duplicate assistance. So if there is another program that has more specific authority, then FEMA won't pay for those costs. So you typically need to be thinking about whether one federal program is more specifically targeted to the type of cost or expense that you're incurring or seeking assistance for, and go apply for that before going to seek assistance from the more general authority, which FEMA typically thinks of itself as the more general authority. All right, next slide. All right, so you get your audit. So if you have a financial audit, what you really want is an unqualified opinion with no findings. But so what does that mean? What are the different types of financial audit results that you can get? So if you get an unqualified opinion, that's that your financial statements are free of material error and may be relied upon. This is the good stuff. If it is a qualified opinion, it's your financial statements were auditable, but you do have some financial or compliance issues that materially affect one or more funds within the overall financial statement. If you get a disclaimed opinion, that's that your financial statements are not reliable. They have material negative findings, but are not capable of being trusted. So you really don't want a disclaimed opinion. And then, so what you would want here is you want that unqualified opinion, which is that top one. And actually, I probably should have switched these other two because you'd rather not have any findings. But if you do have any findings, you'd want a non-material finding over a material finding. So a non-material finding are those issues regarding matters of law, policy, or scope of the grant, but they don't call into question the integrity of your financial statements or your internal controls. A material finding raises serious concerns about matters of law, policy, or the scope of the grant. So, so those are for financial audit results. For program audits, program audits frequently do contain recommendations that are they can range from a finding that something was completely disallowed, and it violated procedures, all the way through to a recommendation that an agency change a policy or provide training. It is very common for program audits to result in findings. So that DHSIG, apologies, that DHSIG March 2021 report analyzing its reports involving PA grants from 2012 to 2018 that analyzed 328 reports, contained 964 recommendations. There were only 61 of those 328 reports that had no recommendations. So it is very likely that audits will result in recommendations. So you shouldn't feel like you're particularly picked on if yours does contain a recommendation. And those IG and GA reports will be published, and copies will be sent to the congressional committees of jurisdiction. This is common. It might be unique to you, but it is not unique to the IG or GAO process or the congressional committees of jurisdiction. Just try to go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just chime in too from a kind of GAO perspective. What Erin is saying is very true, in that, you know, we do tend to make recommendations. The vast majority of our reports have recommendations, and I think that is also kind of part of the consequence or you know, the outcome from kind of what we're talking about with, we may start off with a question from the Hill on, can you look at this and this and this? And then as we get in, that may shift a little bit in terms of what our focus winds up being based on what we find along the way. And that's to be able to kind of focus our efforts on areas where there are things that could need attention or could benefit from some different tweaking in the regulatory landscape or program management, et cetera. So, and that's what we would highlight then or suggest via a recommendation, or in some cases, what we call a matter for congressional consideration, meaning we suggest tweaks to the law in some cases.
Yeah, so those recommendations then go to the agency, and from a subgrantee's or subrecipient's perspective, that recommendation could say to deobligate, $100 million. But the agency might not necessarily agree with that recommendation. It's possible that management could say, well, we want to use our discretion to resolve that in some other way. So that audit report results in a management decision and how they'll implement it. Tom, do you want to say anything about investigations here, or wait till later?
We'll talk about those in more detail, in fact, on the next slide a little bit, and then later. So we'll keep going.
Okay. So in responding to audit results, the first response is to take corrective action. So address the concern and implement the recommendation, promptly following up to take corrective action. Also, if there is a management finding that is negative to you, so for example, say FEMA issues a determination memo saying that funds will be deobligated or recouped in response to a GAO audit or an IG audit, that decision is appealable following the regulations at 44 CFR 206.206. So if you do have a negative finding that impacts you, you should be able to appeal those just following the agency procedures. So if it is FEMA, you have the ability to appeal any determination by the agency under the Stafford Act. And the agency's timeline for that is 60 days from the date that you receive that determination. And that is a hard and firm deadline. So don't sleep on it. You also should be prepared for potentially additional negative attention. So if that that recommendation questions your responsibility, it's possible that an agency could proceed with suspension or debarment action. The recommendation itself wouldn't result in the suspension or debarment. The agency S&D official would proceed with a review and all of the processes for suspension and debarment if that action was going to be taken. So a suspension, just so that you're aware of it, a suspension is a temporary measure up to 12 months in response to an immediate need, and a debarment is usually 3 years in length based on the preponderance of evidence. And it keeps an entity from contracting with the federal government or receiving assistance from the federal government.
Well, yeah, of course, Erin, the worst case scenario is it's worse than, well, suspension and debarment is often the worst case scenario because it often sounds the death knell for a company. But obviously, you could be looking at fraud or false claims act or criminal investigations. We'll talk about a little of those later, but this often may focus on maybe an individual within an entity, or it could be looking at the company as a whole if the leadership was involved in something that may drive whether it's a civil or criminal investigation. And many times audits, as we'll talk about, do reveal misconduct, and that is a important role in that process. So as we'll talk about, let's go to the next slide. What are some of those common things that do get found that are more in the fraud examples? Corrupt influence and kickbacks. I mean, this is the essence of the use of government money is often the core problem is this idea of kickbacks and the idea of directing it to particular people. That is the form of influence and kickbacks, both to people in the government or people in the ones who've been appointed to administer federal funds, like grantees. So that there's many cases we can talk about with those. Bid rigging. This is often, providing inside information like the independent cost estimates or tailoring bids to make sure it goes to original awardee. Billing fraud, very common in both government contracts and grant contracts, in the sense that you're including costs intentionally, not just by mistake, that are designed to take reimburse otherwise things. Delivery fraud, claiming to be delivering supplies to someplace but diverting it somewhere else for a different sale. And as we'll talk about some of the examples, I think in the grant area, especially, lack of actual entitlement is probably the #1 area, and often the easiest for the government to root out these kind of fraud examples when you're talking about lack of actual entitlement, because those are sometimes after the fact, and usually you'll see someone gets the award, they have the award for a year or two, and then the audit comes and it comes crashing in. So let's go to the next slide. So here's a couple examples. This is one, a lot of the, cleanup and destruction and fire. It's similar in the private sector when you talk about insurance fraud, where people claim, in my house fire, I lost the Hope Diamond. It was in my jewelry box, right? No, this is the kind of stuff where, people claim to get these benefits. This is an example of a recent one in 2020 out of California with the wildfires, where people claimed to have residences within the areas affected by the wildfires and claimed and were awarded benefits. And in the audits realized that was not their true residence at the time, and eventually were in fact indicted and I believe pled guilty to those offenses. Next slide. Here's where sometimes you have to look the government insider role. Here is a really interesting situation. It kind of talks on two of the concepts we talked about: the double awarding of benefits to a particular project and the insider dealings here. This is someone working in the call centers and finds out from a recipient, hey, I was awarded twice for the same thing. How do I give the money back? Well, this person comes up with a great idea. Well, here's my bank account information. Just send me the information, send that award to there. Of course, he doesn't tell him it's his. He comes up with a fake name and a fake account number and things like that. So, this money it is tracked and audited, and this is why it's audited. Next slide. Here's another one where, again, this goes to an administrator of a grant. Here you have someone who was taking care of grants designed to help with training fire chiefs and various counties, and was basically submitting bills for things and getting reimbursements that were not actually being spent or not actually used on behalf of the fire associations. They could have been taken personally, resold, this kind of thing. And doing so, this is a substantial loss to the government. These kind of frauds are the things why audits will pick these things up, because when you buy something, there should be a record of where that thing went and a property book where that was assigned and who it was given to. And that's why audits are important to rooting out these kind of crimes. Next slide, please. So talk about a couple things here. First, there is this particular interest, and it's the GAO Advisory 2604, spent out in 2020, is talking about public assistance work grants and some of the specific warning areas dealing with this procurement and debris removal. And what it is it shows you how GAO, through its auditing process, comes up with recommendations and ideas and sends it to administrative agencies, the various agencies that provide service for, like FEMA, and it gives advice. And here, this advice, if you go to this report, it talks about some very practical things like additional training, identifying lead agencies for accountability, conducting regular risk assessments for areas, updating policies, updating key resources for training and guidance for new employees, and implementing specific anti-fraud training. Right? So there's a number of things where this is both a preventative and a corrective process that GAO engages with its studies. Michelle, what do you note from this?
Yeah, just to kind of follow on with what you were saying on some of the FEMA specific things. I mean, a lot of our work is looking at a kind of broader multi-agency or multi-impact thing, but what you're saying with some of the identified fraud cases and lack of entitlement, we do have kind of a lot of this kind of work that you mentioned is targeted by led by the respective IGs in the agency. GAO, we will go in and we will do things looking at kind of not individual actors, but we will kind of look at, for example, school lunch programs, who's entitled to receive these lunches or not, and pull the data from IRS on taxpayers' incomes and kind of run the means testing essentially and identify, for example, one of our reports, we kind of looked at identifying who is receiving student lunch dollars that should not be, and took it one level. And some of those people that were identified were agency officials themselves across dozens of agencies. And so how do we respond to that? We take that data and we reached out to the individual agency IGs to say, here's the list for your agency, kind of went agency by agency on that. Similarly, on things like Medicare fraud, farmers or people receiving farm subsidies, we'll go in and we will take the data and look at who's receiving improper payments based on eligibility criteria. And again, looking at kind of income streams or whether someone is eligible or not. And we will identify en masse, basically, groups of people that have not, and that, that does generate a lot of media attention. A lot of the investigation stuff is not handled from within GAO, though it's turned back over to the IGs or the other people that, the other entities that have the more kind of expertise in the criminal realm for that. So I would just say
I did want to just interrupt just momentarily, since we are at the top of the hour. Instead of rushing through this, I wanted to just take a quick pause, and we can stay on for a few more minutes. So for the people who can hang out for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, we can kind of walk through these remaining slides, which you should have access to those as well. But I did want to, while we still have a decent crowd on here, put up the contact information for Tom and Erin, if you have any questions on this. And again, I didn't see any in the chat here, but feel free to reach out to myself or any of our speakers here. But so if you have to go, we understand, no hard feelings. It is the top of the hour, but I'm going to go back in here, and I think we can probably get through this in another 5 or 10 minutes here if you want to hang out for just a few more minutes with us.
Yep.
Okay, so stepping forward to slide 20. All right, so actually one more back, I think. No, 4. So there's one that starts with being prepared and timely filing quarterly financial status reports is the top. There you go. So the top things that you should be doing right now to be prepared is establish internal controls to help identify and avoid fraud, waste, abuse, and to track your federal grants and to make sure that they are only used for eligible purposes. As a part of that, you should assign a grant manager so that there is one person, preferably somebody with at least a backup, that may lead a whole team of other people, but that there is somebody, at least one person, who is assigned to managing that grant and to making sure that you timely file all your reports, that you respond to any questions, that you maintain all your invoices, that you've properly procured things. One person, at least, who is paying attention to that grant. Also, make sure that your scope of work is, once your scope of work is complete, promptly proceed to close out. Don't let it languish. FEMA in particularly does have a statute of limitations as to the time period after which the agency may go back and recoup funds. So you want to be diligent on completing the work and promptly proceed to close out. And also keep thorough records. So for example, if you're going to meet with the agency, keep meeting notes. If there aren't communications back and forth, maybe send a thank you letter following up that summarizes the conversation that you had with the agency officials. If the agency says it generated a document or a report, ask for a copy. Take videos or photographs of your facilities before and after the event, before any of the work is done, so that you're keeping records of the disaster caused damage. Also, make sure, to the extent that you can, have a maintenance plan and follow that maintenance plan, so that if the agency later claims that your damages weren't actually caused by the disaster, you can have documentation on hand that shows that you actually did properly maintain your facilities. And finally, insure your facilities to the extent they are insurable, so that you're not purely relying on federal assistance. Next slide. So these are some COVID-19 specific things that you could do right now. Make sure you follow CDC guidance or guidance from an appropriate public health official in taking remediation or actions to address the pandemic. Make sure your contracts are federally compliant. Document, again, we keep saying this over and over again, document how your dollars are spent, and try to track them facility by facility. Again, that's how FEMA tends to create its projects. So rather than thinking in general, if you can track how a dollar was spent by a eligible facility, that might help you later on. Keep your invoices, keep your timesheets, and track how your goods are distributed or used. So if you buy a hospital bed, make sure that you know where that hospital bed went and that you can show that you needed that hospital bed as a result of a surge in COVID-19 needs, not just because you were updating your hospital beds. And then timely complete your financial audits. And next, be ready for investigation. Tom, over to you.
Well, I think investigation takes on a whole new tenor and tone than when you're having an audit. An audit is something that's done on a routine in most cases, maybe some triggered, but typically no one's is accusing you of anything yet, or really investigating you for something. An investigation is usually the follow-on. If an auditor finds something that's concerning or troubling or irregular, OIG may conduct the investigation. OIG is typically the ones who will investigate it, though it could be the Federal Bureau of Investigations. There's OIGs at the agencies, there's OIGs at GAO. So any one of these folks could be doing it. Typically, they may request documents voluntarily, could be by subpoena. Individuals in an OIG are also what are called 1811. They're criminal law enforcement officers that work with AUSAs to get search warrants and grand jury subpoenas. So it could execute that way. They could show up at your employees or former employees' houses and interview them. They may contact finances. This is the stuff, though, when it happens, it's a follow-on and it should be concerning. And this is not the kind of thing you want to just kind of do by the seat of your pants. You want to have close consultation of your rights, legal counsel, and it's important. And it can be very serious. It can result in criminal cases or civil cases. Key thing to understand about OIGs, though, is their jurisdiction runs with the dollars and things associated with their agencies. So, for instance, let's say you're investigating, the use of, if it involves FEMA funds, FEMA is going to be able to investigate the use of their funds, where if it's some other agency funds, they're, so there's a little bit of there is some jurisdictional issues there. FBI obviously has a much broader scope. I do think, though, that this is something that's a natural consequence and not unusual, especially in things involving healthcare and other activities, that you're going to see OIG investigators. Next slide. Obviously, the self-study, we included some links here for some things that are helpful if you're working in this area. But one of the unique ones on here is the GAO Yellow Book. So maybe Michelle, you could talk briefly about that.
Oh yeah, just the Yellow Book, if you're interested in kind of how we go about making our recommendations and developing our findings, we're looking at, it's called Condition, Criteria, Cause and Effect. It's all laid out in the mighty Yellow Book, generally accepted government accounting standards. So it really does kind of lay out the sufficiency of evidence standards that are out there, and provides some interesting, provides illustrative examples on kind of what qualifies for evidence and what does not, and basically kind of helps lay out the process and general understanding. So I invite people to look at that.
Great. Again, I think if you go to the final slide, Andrew, thank you. I mean, this is a really important topic. We're in an era where there's a lot of disaster relief activities. We have COVID, we have lots of funds moving around. If you're running in that space, doing work in that space, it's what's the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So it's worth consulting with someone ahead of time before you do things to make sure you do it right the first time. And obviously, we appreciate Michelle getting some break from GAO to come share some of their insights. But obviously, I enjoy working with people like Erin, and we have a lot of expertise. And I think it can be helpful to have those discussions in the future if you get in this area. Anything else, Michelle or Erin, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that so Baker Donelson's website also hosts our disaster recovery briefs. These are published when notable changes or resources occur in the world of disaster recovery. So if you want to, those are publicly available, posted on our website. But if you'd also like to get those sent to you when they're issued, feel free to send me an email and I'll get you on the distro list.
Thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
All right, just a couple of quick closing comments. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Baker Donelson, very active. The firm's very active in this space. A couple of their attorneys are on our ABA committee and also with the Young Lawyers Division. If you're looking at doing volunteer work in this space, helping, maybe not in the OIG audit spectrum, but maybe helping people in the individual assistance program with disaster-related legal issues. The Young Lawyers Division does have a disaster legal services program. They're looking for volunteers to help take disaster-related cases. Get in touch with me if you're interested in that. Our committee is always looking for topics like this where we can provide these kind of lunch and learn at no cost, whether or not you're an ABA member or not. So again, if you have any suggestions, feel free to let us know. I do apologize for the 40 or so people that hung out for the extra 10 minutes for keeping you a little bit long, but hopefully this was beneficial, and we hope to see you again at a program later on in the year. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much. Bye-bye.